Because the moment you cut off contact and remain completely gone, something in their mind doesn't just get upset, it fractures in a psychological sense. Not emotionally in the way most people assume, but internally at the level of control and perception. You have removed their mirror, and narcissistic structures do not operate properly without reflection. They don't process separation like healthy individuals who gradually accept loss. Instead, they react, they spiral internally, and they begin to compute and reassess. And what follows tends to unfold in a very consistent and predictable psychological sequence. If this is resonating with you, take a moment and subscribe, because understanding this type of psychological pattern is what helps you stay detached and no longer emotionally reactive. When extended no contact begins, it is not experienced by the narcissistic mind as grief in any healthy or emotional sense. There is no authentic mourning, no deep heartbreak, and no reflective sadness about what was lost or what went wrong. Instead, what gets activated is something far more destabilizing for their internal structure. It is the loss of control itself. Control functions as the central currency in this psychological framework. Attention, reactions, emotional access, validation, and even conflict all serve as forms of psychological supply that reinforce their sense of importance, identity, and dominance. When you completely remove yourself and remain silent, you are not just ending communication, you are collapsing the entire feedback system that regulated their internal stability. Your absence creates what feels like an immediate vacuum of influence. They can no longer interpret you, provoke you, correct your emotional narrative, or extract reassurance through your responses. That silence becomes a problem their mind cannot solve using its usual methods. In the initial stage, their thinking attempts to search for familiar leverage points. They mentally revisit previous conversations and interactions, not to understand emotional depth, but to locate where influence once existed and how it might be reactivated. This is why no contact feels so disruptive and disorienting to them. They are accustomed to pressing psychological buttons and receiving predictable responses. But silence provides no feedback at all, no reaction, no emotional signal to interpret. The brain in this pattern is heavily organized around external validation. So when that external feedback loop suddenly disappears, internal anxiety begins to rise sharply. That anxiety rarely stays stable for long. It typically transforms into irritation and then escalates further into anger, because anger feels more powerful and less vulnerable than helplessness. From an outside perspective, it may look like they are missing you or reflecting on the relationship, but internally, it is not about emotional longing. It is about frustration over lost access and lost influence. They are not missing your presence as a person in the emotional sense. They are missing your availability, your responsiveness, and the ability to still impact your emotional state. This is also why they may attempt indirect probing behaviors, such as checking your social presence, asking mutual contacts about you, or using subtle symbolic actions designed to provoke curiosity, guilt, or emotional reaction. Each of these behaviors functions as a test, a way to determine whether the previous level of control can somehow be reestablished. The longer the period of no contact continues, the more clearly the psychological message becomes established. Access has been removed, and emotional authority over you is no longer available. This realization is deeply destabilizing to that identity structure because it is built around the assumption of influence over others. Without that influence, their internal self-image becomes unstable and fragmented, since identity in this framework is often externally anchored. Your silence does not communicate anger, rejection, or emotional retaliation. Instead, it communicates something far more disruptive to that system: independence. And independence is especially intolerable because it signals that they are no longer central in your emotional world, no longer necessary for your attention, and no longer in control of your reactions or decisions. Silence is interpreted as rejection within this framework because self-worth is not internally regulated, but externally derived. There is no stable inner identity functioning independently in the same way emotionally secure individuals experience. Instead, self-value is constantly adjusted based on attention, engagement, validation, and emotional response from others. When you initiate no contact and maintain complete silence, that entire stream of validation is abruptly cut off. To this mindset, silence is never neutral. It does not feel calm or peaceful. It is interpreted as dismissal, abandonment, and humiliation all at once. Being ignored is internally equated with being devalued. In many cases, even negative attention is preferred over no attention at all because anger, argument, and emotional conflict still confirm existence and significance. Silence, however, provides no emotional reflection whatsoever. There is no feedback loop to orient identity around. This creates internal discomfort because it forces confrontation with something deeply avoided: the possibility of irrelevance in your life. What intensifies this experience further is their sensitivity to perceived social hierarchy. There is a constant internal scanning for dominance, status, and control dynamics in relationships. When you stop responding, explaining, defending, or emotionally engaging, the entire power structure shifts without any direct confrontation. They are no longer actively maintaining distance. Instead, distance is effectively imposed upon them. That shift is experienced as rejection, even if no explicit rejection was ever spoken. This is precisely why silence can produce far stronger psychological reactions than direct confrontation. Arguments still provide engagement, attention, and a sense of participation in the dynamic, even if it is negative. But silence removes the entire arena. There is no audience, no emotional response to analyze, and no interaction to manipulate or interpret. Internally, this often triggers shame. But shame is one of the most intolerable internal states for this personality structure. Because it cannot be processed in a healthy way, it is quickly converted into other emotional forms such as anger, contempt, denial, or even imagined narratives of revenge and justification. They may internally frame you as cruel, immature, or unreasonable for disappearing. But that story exists primarily as a defense mechanism to protect the fragile internal structure from collapse. Beneath that protective narrative lies a more difficult truth they cannot consciously accept. Your silence demonstrates that they no longer have access to influence your emotional world. And within this psychological framework, rejection is not primarily about losing affection. It is about losing significance. Your absence of response becomes undeniable evidence that their presence is no longer required or prioritized. That realization is far more impactful than any spoken insult or argument could ever be. After an extended period of no contact, this internal system often moves through a repeating psychological cycle that can include confusion, anger, and strategic calculation. It does not always appear in a clean or linear order externally, but internally, the pattern is remarkably consistent. Initially, confusion emerges because silence violates expectation. This mindset is built around predictable emotional reactions, even if those reactions are conflict-based or negative. When no reaction occurs at all, the mind struggles to interpret the absence of feedback. There is an ongoing expectation that at some point you will respond, react, or re-engage. When that expected moment does not arrive, uncertainty begins to take hold. That uncertainty often transforms into anger. This anger is not always outwardly explosive or visible. In many cases, it is internal, cold, and controlled. What drives it is the realization that emotional influence and narrative control are no longer available. Even without any direct confrontation, it can feel like a challenge to their authority or significance. This anger exists because silence forces a confrontation with helplessness, and helplessness is psychologically intolerable within this structure. Anger feels more empowering than vulnerability, so the mind defaults to it as a protective response. Once anger stabilizes internally, the next stage often becomes calculation. At this point, emotional reaction gives way to strategic thinking, where the focus shifts from feeling to planning, interpreting, and considering possible ways to regain influence or reopen access. They begin to question themselves about how to re-establish leverage rather than focusing on how to repair the relationship. Their thinking shifts toward control instead of connection. They run through a set of familiar strategies based on what has worked for them in the past: charm, guilt, intimidation, triangulation, or adopting a victim role all start to feel like usable tools again. Every possible action is silently evaluated through a single internal filter. Will this produce a reaction? In this stage, they might look composed on the surface, sometimes even detached or unaffected. But internally, their mind is active and calculating. They are mentally rehearsing different outcomes. Should they initiate contact directly or wait for you to move first? Should they act as if they have moved on in order to trigger jealousy or insecurity? Should they attempt to damage your reputation in order to protect their own self-image? Each possibility is weighed based on how effectively it might restore dominance or preserve their sense of superiority. If none of these approaches generate the desired result, frustration begins to build. They may withdraw temporarily and convince themselves that they are finished with the situation. But this withdrawal is rarely genuine closure. It functions more as a reset, a way to regain emotional balance and reassess strategy. The pattern can re-emerge if they detect even a slight opportunity to regain influence. Extended no contact disrupts this cycle not by overpowering them, but by removing the feedback they depend on. Without emotional response, their confusion has nowhere to land. Anger loses its target, and strategic thinking becomes ineffective. What surfaces over time is ego injury, which is the deeper psychological wound exposed through sustained absence of contact, and it is often far more impactful than people initially understand. The narcissistic ego is not true confidence or stable self-worth. It is a fragile internal structure designed to shield them from feelings of shame and inadequacy. Much of their behavior, including charm, control tactics, manipulation, and image management, is built around avoiding exposure to that underlying sense of insignificance. When you remain silent and do not return, that protective system begins to weaken. No contact communicates something without words, that they no longer hold influence over your emotional world. To them, this is experienced as a loss of significance and status. They are no longer central, no longer the reference point, no longer the one who defines the rhythm of connection or separation. That shift produces ego injury. Ego injury is not simple sadness. It is a mixture of humiliation, internal tension, and a sense of helpless exposure. The person feels diminished, replaced, and psychologically uncovered. Even in the absence of an actual replacement, their mind begins searching for one. They may obsess over how they are being viewed. Are you happier without them? Have you moved on completely? Do others now see them differently? These thoughts create internal instability because their self-worth relies heavily on external validation. Without attention or feedback, their internal structure becomes unsteady. This kind of injury often leads to strong defensive reactions. Some individuals respond with hostility, attempting to regain superiority through insults, threats, or attempts to damage your reputation. Others respond with emotional detachment and contempt, convincing themselves that you were never valuable to begin with, or that you were beneath them all along. This is not true indifference, but rather a protective psychological adjustment. In order to manage the blow to their self-image, they must mentally downgrade the perceived value of the other person. This helps them avoid confronting the deeper impact of rejection. The difficulty with ego injury is that it cannot be resolved through internal reflection alone, because genuine self-reflection would require accepting responsibility and acknowledging fault. For someone with a highly defensive self-structure, this would threaten the entire internal identity system. As a result, blame is pushed outward. You become labeled as the problem. You become the one who is cruel, unfair, or ungrateful. This externalization allows them to preserve their self-image while avoiding internal collapse. Sustained no contact keeps this psychological pressure active. Each passing day without response reinforces a reality they struggle to accept, that they no longer hold the same emotional importance. The decision to choose peace and distance over continued engagement becomes evidence of their reduced influence, and this realization is often experienced as the deepest form of injury. After a long period of no contact, many individuals enter a quieter stage of behavior that can be described as distant monitoring before any direct action is taken. This phase is subtle and often misunderstood because on the surface, it may appear as though they have completely moved on. Internally, however, attention does not fully disappear. Instead, it shifts into observation without engagement. During this stage, they may watch from a distance, often through indirect means. This can include checking social media repeatedly, asking mutual contacts subtle questions, or gathering fragmented information about your life through third parties. The purpose is not emotional connection, but information gathering. They are trying to assess your current emotional and life state without exposing themselves to rejection or further psychological discomfort. This form of observation gives them a sense of control while keeping them emotionally safe from direct interaction. What they are primarily scanning for is emotional evidence. Are you struggling or thriving? Do you appear affected or unaffected? Are you referencing them in any way, directly or indirectly? Every small detail is interpreted as data that might indicate whether they still hold relevance. This helps them regulate uncertainty while deciding whether any further action is worth taking. Importantly, they are not seeking closure. They are seeking leverage. Signs of vulnerability or emotional instability in you may reinforce their belief that influence still exists. Signs of calmness, growth, or indifference can be more unsettling because indifference implies loss of control rather than active emotional resistance. When no emotional signal is visible at all, it creates a psychological gap that is difficult for them to interpret. Because of this uncertainty, they may delay direct contact. Acting too quickly risks confirming that they have been replaced or fully forgotten. Waiting allows them to construct internal narratives that preserve their sense of superiority, such as believing you are pretending to be fine or will eventually respond. These narratives help them maintain psychological balance while observing from a distance. This monitoring behavior also serves an image-preserving function. By remaining silent, they can later reinterpret events in a way that positions them as the one who disengaged by choice. They may frame themselves as unaffected, indifferent, or in control of the separation. This becomes especially important in social environments where reputation and perceived dominance carry weight. If they eventually do act, the behavior is usually calculated rather than emotional. The timing and method are chosen based on what is most likely to provoke a reaction while minimizing personal risk. Extended no contact disrupts this entire process by removing the data they rely on. Without feedback, there is nothing to interpret, no emotional signals to analyze, and no behavioral cues to exploit. Their monitoring becomes ineffective, and without usable information, their sense of control weakens. Over time, this leads to frustration, uncertainty, and a gradual loss of psychological leverage. As time continues and no contact remains unbroken, attempts to re-establish contact, often referred to as hoovering behaviors, do not simply disappear. Instead, they tend to change form. Initial attempts, when they occur early, are often more impulsive and emotionally driven, sometimes appearing direct or obvious because they are fueled by urgency or discomfort. However, when long periods of no contact persist, these behaviors typically evolve into more calculated, restrained, and strategically timed actions designed to minimize risk while maximizing potential response.